That's a great sentence to learn the present perfect with. What have you done with your dog? I have lost it, it has been stolen. So there's a lot of fun to be had from these books. But there is a serious side to it too, of course. And the serious side is looking at how methodology has evolved and how it's represented in these books, and how some aspects of it are unchanging. And on the subject of methodology, it's interesting, and this is from my Spanish audience, my Spanish-speaking audience, it's interesting that the term for method and the term for course book are sort of conflated in Spanish. It's the same word, essentially, método. So a método is both a course book and a method. There's no distinction made in the language, at least. So you'll get something like this. This is a course I found in Barcelona. It's the new British method, the Método de Inglés by blah, blah, blah. And this is, I came up against this, particularly traveling in Latin America, where people would ask me, what is the latest method? Or have you written a method? And I think, hang on, you don't write methods. And what do they mean here? Of course, is it? And maybe when you talk like that, you think like that. In other words, the course book is, in a sense, a method. And in some respects, it is a kind of incarnation of certain methodological principles. And I want to look at that. This is, incidentally, opening this book up. Here is an illustration which again shows the confusion between the two terms. Why do you always recommend this method? Because it is both practical and pleasant. Not, I should add, not adjectives that often collocate with method. And in fact, it's interesting to look at the adjectives that do collocate with method, and you can do this very easily on an online corpus. This is from the British National Corpus, and these are the adjectives that most frequently collocate in the slot immediately before method. New, scientific, best, effective, simple, etc. Often, again, words, adjectives with very positive collocations. And the sense that methods are kind of good for you. They're new, they're efficient, they're scientific. And there is a strong sense, I think, associated with methods, not just generally, but specifically with language teaching, that people like to think that there is method to our madness. And particularly people who are paying for their courses want to know that this is methodical, that it is grounded in some kind of system. But of course, the term method in the profession has lost currency. We don't talk now about methods as much as we did, say, in the 50s and 60s of the last century. If you look at the kind of history of the term method, very briefly, there was a kind of shift as the communicative approach came in the mid-70s, late 70s, that the term approach substituted method. Method, it was felt, I think, was too prescriptive and too much a kind of one-size-fits-all sort of concept. As English spread globally, and as the number of contexts in which it was taught and the number of purposes for which it was taught and the number of kinds of students, the kinds of teachers, the idea that one single method could address all this enormous diversity of needs became unfashionable. And so the term itself became unfashionable. Around about that same period, in the sort of 80s and 90s, a number of papers came out professing to announce the death of method or the end of methods and the advent of a period of kind of beyond method or post-method era, and that associated with the names of people like Kumar Amadivalu, who wrote, I think in 1995, a seminal paper in which he announced, as it were, the end, or that we're in the post-method era. And then, even more recently, interestingly, people are perhaps suggesting that, yes, this relationship between textbooks and methods is closer than we think. That there is a sense in which the method is the textbook, just as in the Spanish Método. And a paper that came out in TESOL Quarterly a couple of years ago by an Iranian scholar, he said, in fact, the concept of method has not been replaced by the concept of post-method, but rather by an era of textbook-defined practice. What the majority of teachers teach and how they teach are now determined by textbooks. I think this is an interesting thought. I'm not sure if you agree, or in this context, whether that is true. Clearly, in this context, in Iran, when he was writing this, he felt, and he makes a good case for the fact that actually teachers are trained by their books as much as by any kind of pre-service training or in any specific method, and the book determines how you teach. I'll let you. Now I'll leave that thought with you. But on the subject of books, let's go back to my collection. One of the things that I find really interesting about it is how, in many respects, very little has changed. That the books changed, but the methodology, if you like, remains the same, or good methodology remains the same, despite the books and despite the sort of off-the-peg methods that have been promoted at any one point in time. One of my more recent acquisitions, for example, this was from Barcelona again, this book published, I think, in the 1920s. And it was kind of a book which was produced to serve, if you like, the needs of direct method teachers. Now remember, the direct method, no translation, everything mediated in the target language, which relied, of course, on a great deal of visual support. So direct method, Berlitz courses, etc., introduced the concept of, wall charts, visual aids, realia, flashcards, etc. And this book is that and nothing else. It's in a sense like a picture dictionary. It was a beautifully produced book with wonderful graphics like that, with these very detailed illustrations, everything numbered. And on the facing page, there's the key to all the words. And in fact, the book is produced in several different languages, including Esperanto, interestingly enough. Here's another picture from the book with some high-frequency vocabulary like Zeppelin. So it's a beautiful book, and it's very much of its age. But I thought what was particularly interesting to me in it was when you looked at the teacher's notes in the beginning, and there was a page of teacher's notes, I found this, that the author had said, in oral and written exercises of all kinds, an effort must be made to associate the matter under treatment with the pupil's own observations, to illustrate it from his own experience. And this seems to me to be good sense. I mean, refreshingly good sense. And this is supporting the argument I'm trying to make, that in these books, irrespective of the design of the books or the method that they allegedly espouse, there is a lot of common sense. And it's tapping into that common sense, this seam of good pedagogical practice over many, many years that has been one of the gratifications of putting this corpus, if you like, of books together. So what I'd like to do with you now is to share some of the wisdom from these books, but also some bad advice. I mean, just as much good advice, there's bad advice interspersed in these books. And not only the books, but also the teacher's guides. I mean, I've collected a number of books written by this Harold Palmer, who we mentioned earlier today, who did his pioneering work, most of his work in Japan. These are all books I've collected. These are books specifically written for teachers, teachers' manuals on how to teach, dating from, again, the turn of the last century, the early 1900s, right through to the mid-19th century, for the 50s and 60s. And so what I've done is I've extracted some quotes from these books, and I want to sort of hold them up to your... I'm going to ask you to decide whether you think they are good advice, if this is advice that has stood the test of time. So I'm going to kindly draw on the studio audience here to read out selected quotes, but they will be shown on the PowerPoint so you can read as you listen. And then when you've listened to or read the quotation, I want you to vote on it. Yeah? Show of hands, or let's make it, since they can't see your hands in Spain, a cheer or a boo. Are you ready, studio audience? We want to practice this. Can you just give me a cheer? Yay! Okay, give me a boo. Boo. Fantastic. Okay, so, and we have members of the audience who are going to read these aloud. And so first of all, could I call on number 1?
Find your point of contact in the daily experience of the foreigner and lead him as speedily as possible into touch with the language of daily life.
Paul was the first cab off the rank there, yeah. You have to ignore the gender bias of the pronouns, incidentally. I make no apologies for that. So we are talking about him and her, this foreigner. But this is from a book which is nearly as old as I am, The English Becoming Americans, the Teacher's Manual for People Immigrating into the United States. But again, I think this is sound sense. It's a similar sentiment that I showed you in the direct method courses. You need to connect with the daily life of the learner as speedily as possible. Okay, can we have number 2, please, in a loud voice?
Language is not a sterile subject to be confined to the classroom. One of 2 things must be done. Either life must be brought to the classroom, or the class must be taken to life.
No doubt about it. The wonderful Peter Strevens, 1956. But, I mean, you know, it's common sense, but it's a kind of a sentiment that you wouldn't necessarily associate with that period, because we tend to think that this kind of this authenticating the language use was a post-communicative approach development. I think it was particularly suggestive about that quote now is to think how much easier it is than it was in 1956 to bring the outside world into the classroom, or to take the classroom into the outside world because of technology. And that's exactly what we're doing now. I hope that we're taking this classroom out all the way to Spain and back again. Okay, number 3.
The student should never be called upon to say anything that he has not already learned through imitation of his teacher.
Did I hear you booing in Spain? Yeah, and this, again, 1964, we associate that with that particular kind of dip, if you like, in methodological principles, which was associated particularly with audiolingualism and behaviorist psychology. The idea that it's through imitation of good models that you learn. So I think that one we can bin. Number 4.
The teacher must really be himself and give himself, talking to real people about real things, and then training his pupils to talk to one another about real things.
Yeah, well, I think this is getting predictable. There's a kind of thread running through this, but I like the fact that the word real is recycled at least 3 times in that short quote. And again, we tend to associate realness with kind of communicative approach, authentic language, corpora, and all that kind of thing, the real, the Bank of English, etc. But Lionel Billows, way back in 1961, wrote a book full of very, very sensible methodological wisdom, if you like, which really did emphasize the social function of the classroom. Okay, what are we up to? Number 5. Off you go.
A command of structure is more easily acquired by reading, speaking, and writing the language than by hearing and studying explanations.
A sort of lukewarm, yeah. It's almost sort of... it's almost... well, I mean, yeah, this is perhaps a bit more contentious, but it's certainly my feeling of traveling around Japan in the last week is that there is certainly a methodology that's still very current in many schools, which is explaining the grammar is enough, and that the idea that you could learn the grammar or the vocabulary through using it is still somehow a little bit, or not, too unorthodox. And I think, again, what I'm saying and what I'm seeing in Japan is not that different from what I've experienced in Spain, visiting many schools